My grandfather Murray married on the rebound. An engineer by profession, he was assisting Brunel to build a branch line for the Great Western Railway between Slough and Windsor for the benefit of Queen Victoria, when he met and fell in love with Annie Tyrwhitt Drake, the daughter of a wealthy Buckinghamshire landowner. The Tyrwhitt Drakes owned a good deal of South Buckinghamshire and were obviously people of considerable standing in the area, and thinking grandfather's career as assistant engineer to Isambard Kingdom Brunel insufficient qualification for a future son-in-law, smartly sent him on his way. Whereupon he upped and went to Ireland and married Fanny Brereton, the sad widow of an army officer killed in the Indian Mutiny. They settled in Bray, County Wicklow, and had a family of 5 sons and a daughter, Margaret Emily, who later became my mother. Grandfather was obviously an imaginative man, with plenty of initiative, although not much business sense. Turning his hand to pharmaceutical discovery, he invented milk of magnesia, which has been calming the world's stomachs ever since. This made him a good deal of money, and when, after giving him 6 children, poor Fanny Brereton died, grandfather returned to Buckinghamshire, once more asking for the hand of his former love, Annie Tyrwhitt Drake. The reception he received was a good deal more friendly this time, and he was welcomed into the family. He and his new wife returned to Bray, County Wicklow, to bring up the 6 motherless children. The milk of magnesia business prospered, and the family lived in some style, although they would have been a good deal richer if grandfather had not decided to patent the miraculous compound only in the British Empire and its colonies, ignoring the rest of the world. His astute secretary, Diniford, to whom was left a good deal of the managing of the magnesia business, rectified grandfather's mistake, making himself a very rich man at the same time. Eventually, Grandfather Murray was killed after a drunken hunting accident, and his body brought home on a hurdle. Shortly afterwards, Grandmother Tyrwhitt swept the dust of Ireland from off her feet and retired to Little Kimble in Buckinghamshire, taking Margaret Emily with her, and eventually sending her to St. Audrey's School for Girls, Somerset. My mother received a very good education and a lifelong love of literature, which was to prove a consolation years later when she found herself living an isolated and lonely life in a remote house on Dartmoor. My father Ned came from a very different background. His father was a much-respected vicar of Holy Trinity Church in Bury, Lancashire, noted for his holiness and remarkable power of training people in the life of devotion. Ned also came from a large family of brothers and sisters, and it was through one of his brothers that he first met my mother. Margaret Emily had originally been engaged to one of Ned's elder brothers, and everything was arranged for them to be married. Then she met Ned. He was an attractive man, and must have looked very dashing in his uniform of lieutenant in the Royal Indian Marine. She fell in love with him and followed him out to Burma. They were married in Rangoon Cathedral on the 28th of November, 1903. Their first child, Geoffrey Edward, was born 2 years later in Akiab, Burma. He was an enormous baby and was immediately christened Shrimp by his doting parents, a name that he keeps to this day. 2 years later, in Northchurch, Hertfordshire, my brother Peter appeared, and after a decent interval of 4 years, I made my debut. By this time, my mother had moved back to England, and I was born on the 3rd of October, 1911, at the Poplars, Barkhamsted, Hertfordshire. I don't remember much about the Poplars, although I have been back to see it and looked again at the room where I was born. I was pleased to see that the magnificent mulberry tree, which gave us such bumper harvests of delicious mulberries, was still there. It was a lovely tree for climbing, and was a great feature of the garden, with its big, strong trunk and great branches, perfect for small boys. My brothers climbed like monkeys, leaving their wretched little brother standing below, longing to join in. They built a splendid platform high in the branches. It was all of 8 or 9 feet off the ground, but it seemed miles to me. We called it the Jolly Nest, after Swiss Family Robinson. My brothers fashioned a huge net out of string and heaved me, together with a picnic of sandwiches and milk, up into its mysterious branches. We kept quite an establishment at the Poplars. Those were the days when Ned was in full employment in the Indian Marines, and money was not the problem it was later to become. We could afford a cook, scullery maid, housekeeper, nanny, gardener, and gardener's boy, as well as running a pony and trap, which I loved. My first 5 years passed cheerfully, surrounded as I was by an adoring mother, brothers, Florrie, my nanny, cook, and Dart. For some reason we found it impossible to get our infant tongues round the name Margaret, and so she was always called Dart. And her elder sister, who used to come and stay, was called the other Dart. She was my father's younger sister, and she lived with us a good deal. I was very fond of Dart, who fascinated me by making the most lovely lace on a huge cushion. I have no idea how she managed to live, as she had no money and no job. I can only think her brothers must have rallied round her to give her a small allowance. Anyhow, she was a dear, and we loved her. I caught my first fish at Barkhamsted. I was about 5, and Shrimp had kindly taken me fishing for the first time. I can vividly remember it. The canal bank, a bunch of rushes on my right, and casting out the float with a worm on a hook, watching intently, then seeing the float quiver and dip and slide away and disappear. Shrimp shouting at me to strike, and out came, oh joy, a little tiddler, a small roach about 5 inches long. I burst into tears at the excitement of it all. For years afterwards I cried whenever I caught a fish. There was something primeval about it, an event so earth-shattering that I just wept. I did cry fairly easily, and I still do. My brothers disparagingly called me Streaks, because of the subtle combination of dirt and tears. I was not allowed to take the fish home to show Mummy, as Shrimp had been told that you threw back fish which are under a certain length. So, in order to show his superiority, he made me put it back. But from that moment, I was, so to speak, hooked. All I wanted to do was to take it home and show Mummy. If I had been allowed to do that, I might have been cured. But as it was, I had to go back and catch another. And I have been going back ever since. Fishing has been a lifelong passion with me. My devotion to it has caused huge problems in my personal life. My nearest and dearest have often felt unloved and neglected as I strode off for a glorious few days on the Wye or the Test. It is such a magnificent sport that, although I rather regret the pain caused by my obsession, once I am on the riverbank, there is nowhere else I want to be. In 1916, when I was 5, my enchanted life at the Poplars went through a sea change. My mother decided to visit Father, who was in India. It was intended to be only a short visit, but war was raging around Europe, and it became obvious it was too dangerous to return. So she remained in India until 1918. I was sent to join my brothers at a prep school in Sussex called Windlesham House. As I was so young, my nurse Frances was sent with me. I suppose it sounds rather sad for a small child to be separated from his mother, but I can't remember feeling any real unhappiness about it. Brothers Shrimp and Peter were already at the school, and that, together with the comforting presence of nurse, took the edge off any pain. In fact, the pain I do remember was more to do with the fact that I wasn't dressed in a nice uniform like the rest of the boys, but had to wear a rather strange smock. No doubt it was a delightful and lovely garment, but to me it was a silly, girly smock. As there were a few other tinies like me, they had a sort of kindergarten. We were the holiday boys, who, because of the war, were not able to join their parents, so stayed at school during the holidays. We had enormous fun, being at school without schooling, with plenty of room to play. We had football, cricket pitches, trees to climb, and swimming. I was at Windlesham for 9 years, which must be some kind of a record. It was a wonderful school, and still is. My most successful activity there was acting. I remember Asher 2. They weren't much taken with Christian names. I was Hordern 3. Asher 2 and I started a very specialist organisation called the AAA. This stood for the Classroom A Acting Association, and we had a special rubber stamp to prove it. We tended to do everything by committee. We wrote, acted, and directed, naturally giving ourselves the star parts. One of the plays, of which we were particularly fond, was an epic called The Man with the Speckled Face. Why the man had a speckled face, I don't remember exactly, but I do remember enjoying the make-up very much, and we were also very proud of the dramatic effect of torchlight through the bars of the prison, represented by a chair. We thought it very striking. But it was primitive compared to the magnificent production we staged out of doors in front of the rookery. This involved Julius Caesar, a brontosaurus, and some druids. It had a complicated plot, with some effective choral chanting of "Sinister, Dexter, Sinister, Dexter," as the Roman legions were heard approaching, pursued by the brontosaurus, represented by 6 small boys covered in rugs with a great mask head with properly moving parts, which I bravely killed in the last act. I always gave myself the best parts. After all, if you take the trouble to write the play. A boy called Waddy was the chief druid. He must have liked the frock, as he later became a bishop. A line that gave us particular pleasure was, in answer to the question, "Who drew this?" the stunning reply was, "A druid, druid, druid." We thought this tremendously witty. Altogether, my time at Windlesham was very happy. I was well liked and rather a pet. Perhaps too much so. In fact, I think I've been too much of a pet all my life. As soon as the war was over in 1918, my father Ned, who was by now port officer in Calcutta, arranged for Mother to be shipped back to England, bringing with her our new little baby sister, Jocelyn, whom we immediately christened Doody. Doody happened in India. She was the daughter of a Mrs. Reed, the wife of Colonel Reed, who was away fighting in the Gulf. Mother and father were taking a short leave in Dalhousie when Mother was asked by a frantic local GP to assist him with Mrs. Reed, who was about to give birth. With some trepidation, my mother helped to deliver a baby girl, and then another, and then another. These 3 infants were immediately christened, being named Violet, Pamela, and Jocelyn. The first baby, Violet, died almost immediately, followed shortly afterwards by the unfortunate Mrs. Reed. As there didn't appear to be anyone to care for the children, Mother was left literally holding the babies. It was arranged that she should take the children back to England to be handed over into the care of their aunt, another Mrs. Reed. The baby, Pamela, who was brain damaged, did not survive the journey, and was buried at sea off the coast of Ceylon. Jocelyn was made of sterner stuff and thrived, arriving back in England with Mother, ready to be handed over to her aunt. However, there was much consternation in the families when it was discovered that the aunt was an agnostic. My mother was horrified, as was the child's grandmother, who pleaded with Mother to bring the child up as her own. Although doubting her ability to bring up a girl successfully, Mother had grown very fond of Jocelyn and agreed. So my brave parents adopted Doody. My father, Ned, was delighted. He adored her. She was the daughter he had always wanted, and we 3 boys were thrilled. Doody was completely absorbed into the Hordern family, and my brothers were very much nicer to her than they were to me at that age. When I was about 8, we left the Poplars and moved to Brighton. Then, when Ned returned, my parents bought a house in Haywards Heath, and we embarked on family life for the first time. I was 14 when I left Windlesham. I hold the record for being the Windlesham boy who stayed the longest. I then joined my brothers at Brighton College. My brother Peter was an extremely popular chap, head of his house, in the first 15, and a prefect. He later got a blue at Oxford and played rugby for England. A marvellous games player, he knew what balls did, and they did what he told them to do. All this glory reflected upon me for a short time and gave me a certain amount of credibility until they found me out. I was no good at games at all. I didn't excel in any area except singing. I couldn't read music, but I sang quite well. Every Christmas at Brighton College we staged a production of a Savoy opera by Gilbert and Sullivan, and a great deal of time and trouble were expended upon it. My first part was the Duchess in the Gondoliers. I still remember quite a bit of it to this day, and will burst into song at the slightest encouragement. For some reason, I could only sing falsetto by throwing my head back. I don't know why. Perhaps because of the formation of my throat or vocal cords or something. This produces a strange effect of making me look like a chicken when I'm singing. But in spite, or maybe because of this, I was a great success as the Duchess, and went on to play in the men's chorus in Iolanthe. The cast were all splendid, upstanding chaps, and I was very small for my age, and must have looked very funny, a tiny little chap right in the middle. I went on to sing in the men's chorus in the Mikado, and finally took the part of the Major General in the Pirates of Penzance. Although I look back on this as being perhaps the start of the career that I finally embraced, I had absolutely no feeling that I was going that way at all. I had then no burning desire to become an actor. We were not a theatre-going family at all. We went to the pantomime, but never to plays. I didn't see a play till I was 15, when a friend of the family, a curate named Cyril Hudson, we were a great family for curates, took me during the holiday from Brighton to the Adelphi Theatre in London to see Jessie Matthews in Evergreen. You dressed up for the theatre in those days, and I wore a dinner jacket for the first time. We grandly sat in the stalls. I absolutely adored it. Jessie Matthews was marvellous. All big, beautiful liquid eyes, and a great pair of legs. Cyril Hudson had been the curate at Barkhamsted, and a great friend of my mother, who adored dog collars. He rose in his profession to become Canon of St. Albans. He was a great chap. Why he loved me, I don't know, but he was always treating me to this and that. He had married a very wealthy wife, who was also delightful, but they had no children, so perhaps I was the son he never had. He was good and kind, and was always coming up with helpful ideas, like paying the school fees. He educated me more than either of my schools did, and I still have books in my bookcase that he gave me. He was the only one to give me any theatrical encouragement. When we moved as a family to Dartmoor, we didn't go near the theatre, but we did have a wireless and a gramophone. I remember visiting a fellow Windlesham boy whose family had a 5-valve wireless set, which in those days was something tremendously rich and glorious. It didn't have a loudspeaker. The headphones had to be passed round, but it was magic. It was at Brighton College that I met Christopher Hassel, who years later was to influence my decision to embark on a theatrical career. I don't quite know how Christopher and I became such firm friends. We were contemporaries and moved slowly up the school together. I liked his sense of humour. He was an unconventional sort of boy and didn't really fit into the discipline of English public school life. He didn't take any particular notice of dramatic exploits of Sandpaper Nicks on Friday, as we called the officers' training course, to which Brighton College was very loyal. It was a great school for getting up in khaki, shouldering a rifle and drilling. We were all little soldiers every Friday. Oh, those bloody puttees that had to be smoothly wound and, of course, wouldn't wind smoothly and were always overlapping the wrong way. Christopher was not very good at that sort of thing and had wonderful ways of getting out of Friday afternoon parades. I can't say I was madly keen, but I obediently shouldered arms, did all sorts of things correctly, and became an under-officer. I got to know him better in the holidays when he took me to visit his father, the artist John Hassel, who was a remarkable and equally unconventional sort of chap. He had a cluttered studio in Notting Hill Gate in which nothing was allowed to be moved, dusted or thrown away, and every spent tube of paint was treasured. I have never concealed that in those days Brighton College was pretty poor academically, though I'm prepared to believe it is a very good school now. A lot of the public schools were new then. They hadn't any real traditions and tended to make them up as they went along. Cricket and rugby football were more important than the classics. Brighton College was under the command of Canon Dawson, a very strong personality, who was also a superb salesman. He expanded the school by at least 200%, so that it grew enormous. The bigger it became, of course, the worse the education. There was no time for individual scholastic encouragement. Thank God for Windlesham, my mother, and Canon Hudson. As I have mentioned, my mother had a great love of literature, especially poetry. She was a real Anglo-Indian, having absorbed the ethos of the British Raj during her time in India. She adored Kipling, reading him to us endlessly. She read to us marvellously and had a quotation for every occasion. This can be irritating and is a habit that I have unfortunately inherited. She was a wonderful mother, not only to me and my two brothers, but to Doody as well. She was tremendously affectionate in a formal way, particularly to me. She was a powerful woman, the power in the family, really, which made the marriage tricky in its later years. She had a strong sense of duty, and I suppose she was a bit austere and frightening to some people, but not to me. I wonder sometimes whether she had a sense of humour. I remember on her birthday I gave her a Just William book. Just William was a passion of mine. I adored William's heroic qualities and longed to be like him, the chief of the outlaws. She practically never opened it, and I don't think she read a word of it. I couldn't understand how anyone wouldn't find it absolutely riveting and terribly funny. It makes me laugh still, but maybe Just William is an acquired taste. My disappointment at her reception of my gift has stayed with me all these years. Mother had a far better brain than my father and was educated to a much higher standard. Poor Ned never read a book in his life. The basic thing I have to say about him is that I never really knew him. I never really met him until we went to live on Dartmoor. He was rather the paterfamilias, a hangover from Victorian family life. With his strict Anglican upbringing, he became known, in his service days, as Holy Joe. He conducted family prayers at Haywards Heath. We all knelt down and prayed in the dining room every morning. I don't pray now, and I can't find myself in tune with the Anglican service. My father would be horrified, less so my mother, although she was extremely God-fearing and disciplined in the faith. There were no family discussions about religion. God was God, and that was that. And the Bible was the Bible. We were not a family who discussed things. Ned hardly talked to us at all. I regret to say he didn't impinge much on my life. It was in 1925, during my first term at Brighton College, that we moved from the comfortable suburbanity of Haywards Heath to a remote house on Dartmoor, Jordan Manor. My parents saw an advertisement in the Times, and Shrimp was dispatched on his motorbike to look at the house. He was wild with excitement when he saw it, and telephoned the parents to come and have a look. They went down to see it, agreed it was ideal, and bought it for £800. I suppose the idea of the move was to experience real country. I also think it might have been a way of saving money. The move to Dartmoor was a tremendous watershed in the family's history. Though it was to some extent a practical and economical step, it must have been very difficult for my parents. They had so little in common that I wonder what on earth drew them together in the first place. My father, Ned, was in many ways a very attractive man, and of course their life in India must have been glamorous and exciting, so I suppose there must have been a certain chemistry between them. Yet going to live on Dartmoor and deliberately cutting themselves off from any real social life must have put a tremendous strain on them. They were thrown upon each other's company far more than before. I look back and wonder how on earth they survived it. It was thrilling for me, of course, everything a boy of 14 could hope for. But there was no one within anything like neighbourly reach with whom my parents could play bridge or enjoy social contacts. There was no village. Jordan was a hamlet, the centre of which was our house, the manor house, and the mill with the water wheel for grinding flour, which was run by Ernie Warren, white with flour from head to toe, who lived in the cottage opposite the mill. My parents' sense of isolation must have increased even more because they were what we call snobs. They were particularly careful about Doody mixing with a lower social class. Looking back, it was a terrible attitude, and very much isolated Doody. She was sent away to a boarding school in Somerset, which she loved. There was no question of any of us going to the local village school with the village children. This awful snobbery is illustrated by the Massons. Next door to us in Jordan, there wasn't much door to be next to, lived a very nice family called Masson. There were two little girls of Doody's age, but any relationship between them was discouraged. And although they lived only 50 yards away, in 10 years I never remember either of the two Masson children coming into Jordan Manor, or my mother going to the Massons for a cup of sugar or some butter in a neighbourly way. They were not considered our class because Mr. Masson was a vet. It made no sense, but I'm afraid that was how the class system was in those days. This attitude was quite usual, and it never occurred to us that there was anything odd about it. So there we were, poor as church mice, but terrible snobs. I liked Mr. Masson very much. He was a wonderful chap, a broad Scot. So nice and so good. He and I used to go fishing almost every night in the school holidays, tramping off into the woods, fishing for sea trout, and not once did he complain or refer to the situation. I had far more in common with Mr. Masson, and more friendship and companionship than I ever had with my father Ned. Ned had no visible means of financial support except his pension of £40 a month. There was not much on which to bring up a family. Having been in a senior rank in the Indian Marine, accustomed to servants and a private yacht, he must have found it difficult trying to look after 4 children, a wife, and countless livestock on a very small income in an isolated house on Dartmoor. He must have pondered over it in his study at Jordan, into which he disappeared every morning with a huge cup of coffee and the previous day's copy of the Times. What did he do? To this day, I don't know. During our first summer on Dartmoor, I couldn't be kept off the river. I learnt that sea trout, called peel in the West Country, ran up the Webburn and could be caught on a worm at night. Down in the woods, below Jordan, there was a pool on the river known locally as Headweir Pool. I knew it as the Peel Pool, and it was there that I would go with Mr. Masson night after night in the summer holidays, and rarely come home until the early hours without a sea trout or two. Sometimes there would be several of us at the pool, the Warrens, Nosworthys, Frenches, and Chafes. I recall precisely the sights, sounds, and smells of those summer nights. Boyhood magic. I graduated to fly fishing, and thanks to my motorcycle, a two-stroke Francis Barnett that I used to ride barefoot around the moor, my horizons widened dramatically. By day, I got to know the wilder moorland streams, the East Dart, Swincombe, West Dart, Cherrybrook, Wallerbrook. I was initiated into fly fishing for peel at night, a thrill which is with me still. Those were magic summer nights. The smell of the honeysuckle wafting up out of the woods on the opposite bank, the whistles of the otters coming nearer and nearer by Cunston Island, the sudden strong pull of a 5-pound sea trout. I developed a love of the moor that has never left me. We ate a good deal of fish at Jordan, and there was always fresh fish hanging from a hook in the kitchen. We had 2 dogs, an adorable bitch called Treacle Tart, and a stupid cocker spaniel, inappropriately called Mirth, that someone had given us as a gun dog. She was gun-shy and would run off in the opposite direction as soon as she heard a shot. The cats and dogs used to have their children in a cosy cupboard next to the dining-room fireplace, and puppies or kittens regardless, they were all mothered by Treacle Tart. Father had a horse called Jimbo. We all had a go at riding, and I hunted a bit with the South Devon, which I enjoyed greatly. There was also a beastly little pony called Chloe, which my father had bought for Doody. It turned out to be a very bad-tempered, unfriendly animal, which went mad when you tried to ride it. And then there was the business of the bees. Ned decided we ought to have bees, and obtained 3 hives from Buckfast Abbey. I don't know much about bees, but I understand that the popular bee nowadays is the fairly quiet Italian bee. We had the old English black bee, and he's a bugger. On the whole, I tried to keep out of it all, but I understand that one thing bees hate is being dealt with on a hot day, and definitely not on a Sunday. They are quite particular about this. We had our 3 hives in the top field, and Ned, who had a heart condition and was not supposed to lift heavy weights, decided one hot Sunday to take the honey. As he lifted the excluder from the hive, there was an appalling weight of honey. As he staggered, he knocked the hive, and the bees came out to remonstrate. Ned, being the splendid brave sailor and all that, was determined not to let go of the honey harvest until he had got it to the shed where he kept all his bee things. So he carried the honey, being stung all the way. It was the summer holidays, and we were all there. His brave sons rushed down to the river and plunged in up to their noses. We were the only living things in the area to escape being stung. There was absolute pandemonium. Chickens were screaming and dashing hither and thither, turkeys dropped down dead, and the buzzard, which we had found wounded on the moor and which was living peacefully in the dog kennel, was killed. It was quite a do. All the animals, with their tails up or down or between their legs, were dashing round the countryside screaming. My dear father came up to the house in the middle of all this chaos, and Mother yelled from an upstairs window, "Ned, take your clothes off in the garden," which he did. They were like a hive full of bees. When he came in, she picked 150 stings out of him. He swelled up to twice his size and turned black. The doctor came, and he was touch and go for 24 hours. Afterwards, he used to say that that was the end of his rheumatism. When I eventually left Brighton College, I had to look round for something to do, and the only thing that suggested itself to me was schoolmastering. I got a job at a prep school in Beaconsfield, Norfolk House. The headmaster was a good, quiet man, but his wife was a frightful woman, whom I called Mrs. Tarvin, after the wife of the headmaster in J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions. She ruled the place with a rod of iron and was an absolute bitch. I kept my head down and hoped she wouldn't notice what a hopeless schoolmaster I was. I romantically saw myself dealing with my difficulties with the easy, indolent charm of an Inigo Jollifant. It was during those abortive Beaconsfield schoolmastering days that I joined my first grown-up amateur company and found myself in the finals of a British Drama League competition with a play called Rizzio's Boots. Playing the hero Rizzio, I was discovered behind a curtain in the Queen's bedroom and run through with a sword, like Polonius. The finals of this event were held at Welwyn Garden City. There were 4 plays a night for a week, 24 in all. To our great surprise and mortification, Rizzio's Boots had no success at all, and the play that walked off with all the prizes was something called Not This Man, by one Sidney Box. This play won every single prize, best acted, best written, best dressed, etc., etc. It was highly acclaimed by everyone but me. I suppose that, in an ungraceful fit of sour grapes, I wanted to be the one dissentient voice. Egged on by my friends, and probably quite perversely, I wrote a letter to the Welwyn Times saying that I considered the play to be blasphemous bunk and cheap theatrical claptrap. Days later, my landlady announced a Mr. Box to see me, and there, standing in the garden, was a very large man who turned out to be Sidney Box's brother. Tapping me on the shoulder with an official-looking document, he said, "I think you might be expecting this." Still not knowing what was in the wind, I read, "King George V, by the grace of God, Emperor of India, defender of the faith of Great Britain and Ireland and dominions beyond the seas, to Michael Hordern of 20 Julian's Road, greetings." I read on. It was a writ for libel. I had accused Sidney Box of the most heinous of crimes, blasphemy. Once I had stopped laughing and realized the seriousness of it all, I managed to find a splendidly old-fashioned firm of solicitors, Bull and Bull, in Lincoln's Inn. They were delighted to act for me. They were the family of the actor Peter Bull, and have been my solicitors ever since. The case came up in the High Court of Justice in Lincoln's Inn before Mr. Justice Talbot and a special jury. It was quite a number. I shared the front page of the Evening Standard with Mussolini. Wisely, very wisely as it turned out, as I would have condemned myself out of my own mouth, my counsel did not put me in the box. We won the case, and it didn't cost me a penny. But it cost Sidney Box a great deal. Years later, when I was in a film he was producing at British Lion in Shepherd's Bush, I met him for the first time. "You absolutely broke me," he said. "I paid it back in 12 monthly instalments, but it was marvellous publicity and really started my career." My efforts at schoolmastering had lasted only a term, during which time I had to do all sorts of awful things, like playing cricket. In spite of my inadequacies as a teacher, I'm proud to say that one of my pupils got the top scholarship to Marlborough. Polio, thank goodness, took me out of it all. This ghastly occurrence, unpleasant though it was, gave me time to reflect, and as I lay on my bed of sickness suffering from acute anterior poliomyelitis, I realized I was barking up the wrong tree. Teaching would have been a complete dead end as a career. I had no degree, no right to be there at all. I would never have earned any money. The polio episode happened after the Otter Hunt ball at the Two Bridges Hotel near Princetown. I had driven the old, open Morris Cowley over to the Two Bridges, danced the night away, and got terribly hot. Feeling peculiar, and obviously running a high temperature, I drove back across the moors in the early hours. The next morning I couldn't get out of bed. The doctor was called. There was a great deal of alarm and jumping up and down, and I was out of action for the entire summer and most of the winter. I did manage to persuade the doctor to let me go fishing on the last day of the salmon season. Taking my poor mother up to Dartmoor, we went to a pool called Coomwear, and there, trembling in every limb, I hooked my first salmon. The excitement was too much for me, of course, and the bloody thing got off. I sat down, grown person that I was, and cried my eyes out. It was not until 3 years after my mother had died that I did at last catch my first salmon. It was on the 12th of June, 1935, on the right bank of the Dart, down by Eagle Rock, a 10-pound salmon. So thrilled and excited, so proud was I carried it upstream and waded across the river below Dartmoor, ostentatiously crossing the river, hoping to meet as many tourists as possible at Badger's Holt on the opposite bank. My precious fishing diary, which I began writing in 1929, records that memorable day. It seems a shame that this entry is not made in red ink. I've caught my first salmon, and on the Dart, too. It was a thrill to wait for all these years, for my knees knocked and my heart thumped, and I felt so ill that for some time I honestly wished I had never hooked it. I could see myself weeping beside a broken cast in 10 minutes' time, and I knew how I should feel, but I gave the fish hell in the butt, and in about 5 minutes I had my gaff out. But he saw it and fled. With the gap between my teeth, looking and swearing like a pirate, I played him for another 2 or 3 minutes. I wish I could have seen and heard myself. Then he was on the bank, and "Michael Hordern," I said in a loud voice, "has killed a salmon." And I wanted very badly to cry, as I used to when I got good fish. I was too thrilled to go on fishing, but picked up the fish and hurried back to Dartmoor. I waded across the Dart at one place, at great risk to life, limb, rod and salmon, just for the pleasure of impressing 2 trippers on the opposite bank. I succeeded. "Coo," they said as I went by. "What is it?" "Oh," I said nonchalantly, "salmon, you know." In January 1933, my poor mother died. She was only 59 and died from exhaustion. She had been a marvellous mother, but she had had a hard-working, worrying time trying to rear the 4 of us properly. It wasn't an easy house to live in, and I think she had had enough. All her brave sons were with her when she died. When it was over, we did the most extraordinary thing. We went downstairs, opened one of the bottles of champagne, which had been prescribed by the doctor, turned on the wireless, and listened to the Billy Cotton Band show. What poor Ned must have been feeling didn't bother us at all. The church couldn't hold all the people at her funeral.